typology, as if prose were identical with the prosaic, and prosaic as a term of denigration, meaning dull, commonplace, ordinary, tame, is precisely a Romantic idea. The OED gives 1813 as its earliest use in this figurative sense. In the defense of poetry, that is one of the signature themes of the Romantic literatures of Western Europe, poetry is a form of both language and being, an ideal of intensity, absolute candor, nobility, heroism. The Republic of Letters is, in reality, an aristocracy, and poet has always been a titre de noblesse. But in the Romantic era, the poet's nobility ceased to be synonymous with superiority as such, and acquired an adversary role, the poet as the avatar of freedom. The Romantics invented the writer as hero, a figure central to Russian literature, which does not get underway until the early 19th century. And, as it happened, history made of rhetoric a reality. The great Russian writers are heroes. They have no choice if they are to be great writers, and Russian literature has continued to breed romantic notions of the poet. To the modern Russian poets, poetry defends nonconformity, freedom, individuality against the social, the wretched vulgar present, the communal drone. It is as if prose in its true state were finally the state. No wonder they go on insisting on the absoluteness of poetry and its radical difference from prose. Prose is to poetry, said Valéry, as walking is to dancing, romantic assumptions about poetry's inherent superiority hardly being confined to the great Russian poets. For the poet to turn to prose, says Brodsky, is always a falling off, like the shift from full gallop to a trot. The contrast is not just one of velocity, of course, but one of mass, lyric poetry's compactness versus the sheer extendedness of prose. That virtuoso of extended prose, of the art of anti-laconicism, Gertrude Stein, said that poetry is nouns, prose is verbs. In other words, the distinct genius of poetry is naming. That of prose, to show movement, process, time, past, present, and future. The collected prose of any major poet who has written major prose, Valéry, Rilke, Brecht, Mandelstam, Tsvetaeva, is far bulkier than his or her collected poems. There is something equivalent in literature to the prestige the Romantics conferred on thinness. That poets regularly produce prose, while prose writers rarely write poetry, is not, as Brodsky argues, evidence of poetry's superiority. According to Brodsky, the poet, in principle, is higher than the prose writer because a hard-up poet can sit down and compose an article, whereas in similar straits a prose writer would hardly give thought to a poem. But the point surely is not that writing poetry is less well paid than writing prose, but that it is special, the marginalizing of poetry and its audience, that what was once considered a normal skill, like playing a musical instrument, now seems the province of the difficult and the intimidating. Not only prose writers, but cultivated people generally no longer write poetry, as poetry is no longer, as a matter of course, something to memorize. Modern performance in literature is partly shaped by the widespread discrediting of the idea of literary virtuosity, by a very real loss of virtuosity. It now seems utterly extraordinary that anyone can write brilliant prose in more than one language. We marvel at a Nabokov, a Beckett, a Cabrera Infante, but until 2 centuries ago, such virtuosity would have been taken for granted. So, until recently, was the ability to write poetry as well as prose. In the 20th century, writing poems tends to be a dalliance of a prose writer's youth, Joyce, Beckett, Nabokov, or an activity practiced with the left hand, Borges, Updike. Being a poet is assumed to be more than writing poetry, even great poetry. Lawrence and Brecht, who wrote great poems, are not generally considered great poets. Being a poet is to define oneself as to persist against odds in being only a poet. Thus, the one generally acknowledged instance in 20th century literature of a great prose writer who is also a great poet, Thomas Hardy, is someone who renounced writing novels in order to write